July 30th, 1975. A parking lot in suburban Detroit. A man is standing next to his car in the summer heat. He has faced down the President of the United States. He has stared into Robert Kennedy's eyes across a Senate hearing room and never once blinked. He has run the most powerful labor union in American history. 2.5 million men answer to him. And right now, he is checking his watch, waiting. He doesn't know yet that the waiting is the last ordinary thing he will ever do. A maroon Mercury pulls into the lot. A door opens. A man steps out, 6'4", built like a freight car, wearing a suit in the July heat because men like him always wear suits. Jimmy Hoffa recognizes him immediately. He trusts him completely. That is the last mistake Jimmy Hoffa ever makes. They drive together to a house on a quiet street. 2 men walk inside. Only one walks out. And the man who walks out, the man who just did what no senator, no attorney general, no federal prosecutor had ever managed to do, gets in the car, straightens his jacket, and disappears into the Detroit afternoon like he was running an errand. Jimmy Hoffa was never seen again. His body has never been found. Not one day, not 1 week, 50 years gone. The FBI never closed the case. They never will. And the man who walked out of that house? He spent the next 28 years saying nothing. Living normally, going to dinners, attending weddings, raising daughters who had no idea what their father had done, until the very end of his life, dying of cancer. Too old and too sick to be touched. He finally told someone the truth. Every single word of it. This is that story. And I promise you, by the time it is over, you will never look at loyalty, betrayal, or the American dream the same way again. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are? Every single story I bring you here is for all of us together. And I read every comment. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome home. This is where the real stories live. The ones that Hollywood tried to tell, but could never quite get right. Hit subscribe right now, turn on notifications, and leave a like if you are settling in for a long night. It keeps this channel alive. And now, let's go all the way back to the very beginning. There is a borough just southwest of Philadelphia called Darby. If you have never heard of it, that is entirely by design. Darby is the kind of place that exists in the margins of bigger stories. A small, dense, working-class community of row houses and corner bars, and Catholic churches where the same families have lived for 3 and 4 generations. The air smells like industry. The streets are narrow. The winters are hard. Nobody is rich, and nobody expects to be. It was here, on the 25th day of October, 1920, that Francis Joseph Sheeran came into the world. His father was Thomas Francis Sheeran, Jr., a man of Irish descent who worked with his hands and his back, a steeplejack when the work was available, doing the terrifying high-altitude maintenance on church steeples and industrial chimneys that no one else wanted to do. And when those jobs dried up, a church sexton at our Mother of Sorrows Catholic Church at 48th and Lancaster in West Philadelphia, sweeping the floors and maintaining the grounds of a building where he and his family prayed to a God they believed in with the fervent, unquestioning faith of Irish immigrants who had brought that faith across the Atlantic Ocean as their only real inheritance. His mother was Mary Agnes Henson, Swedish descent, which made young Frank an unusual combination in the Irish Catholic neighborhoods of Philadelphia. Half Irish, half Swedish, completely American, and completely poor. Frank was the oldest of 3 siblings. He had a brother named Tom and a sister named Margaret. The Sheeran household was not a warm one. Frank would later describe his childhood as one lacking in affection. His father was not the kind of man who put his arm around you and told you things were going to be all right. Thomas Sheeran was tough in the way that men of his generation and his class were tough, not because they had chosen toughness as a philosophy, but because the alternative was collapse. And collapse meant your children went hungry, and that was not acceptable. Frank was 9 years old when the Great Depression began in October of 1929. But as he would later tell his biographer, Charles Brandt, the Depression didn't feel like a new condition to the Sheeran family. As far as I was concerned, he said, our family never had money. The Depression simply made visible what had always been true for families like theirs, that they were one bad week away from real hardship. And hardship was always looking for an opening. During the worst years, Thomas Sheeran would take young Frank out to the farms near Derby after dark, and they would steal food, vegetables from the garden, occasionally something from a barn, to feed the family. This was not discussed. It was simply done. You did what you had to do to keep your children fed. This was one of the first lessons Frank Sheeran absorbed about the world, that the law was a luxury for people who could afford it, and survival had its own law, which was simpler and more honest. Frank started working when he was 7 years old, cleaning ash from the coal furnaces in people's cellars. Small money, but money. He would carry this work ethic, this absolute refusal to sit still, to wait for someone to provide for him, throughout his entire life. Whether he was hauling freight across the Northeast, serving as a union official in Wilmington, Delaware, or killing men for the Mafia, Frank Sheeran was always working. His father, Thomas, was an amateur boxer of some skill. The boxing tradition passed directly to Frank, though not in the way most fathers pass things along. Thomas would take his young son into the bars and speakeasies of the neighborhood. Frank was 10 years old, and he would bet money on Frank in matches against older boys. Teenagers, kids who had several years and several pounds on him. When Frank won, Thomas Sheeran collected. When Frank lost, Thomas Sheeran delivered a smack to the back of his son's head that was probably harder than anything the other boy had landed. The message was clear. Losing was not an option, and the people betting on you did not want to hear excuses. Sometimes Thomas would box Frank himself, telling him to throw punches without pulling them, to fight his own father like he meant it. It was a brutal kind of education, but it produced results. By the time Frank was a teenager, he had hands like stone and a pain tolerance that bordered on the supernatural. He felt things, the impact of a fist, the sting of a cut, but he had been trained from childhood to absorb pain without showing it, to let it pass through him like weather, rather than treating it as something that needed to stop him. He attended Darby High School, later known as Upper Darby High School, in Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania. He was expelled in the 9th grade. The circumstances were not ambiguous. He insulted the school principal, and then, when the principal responded as authority tends to respond to insults, Frank Sheeran broke the man's jaw with a single punch. After that, his formal education was over. He drifted for a few years, working the carnival circuit up and down the eastern seaboard, making his way as far north as Maine, where he worked for a logging company, and found himself boxing his co-workers in the camps for entertainment and pocket money. He worked other odd jobs. He discovered, back in Philadelphia, a genuine passion for dancing. Frank Sheeran, the future Mafia enforcer, loved to dance, and was apparently quite good at it. He frequented the dance halls of Philadelphia in his late teens, meeting girls, perfecting the footwork that would later make his coworkers at the trucking yard do a double take. There is something almost poignant about this detail. The big, tough kid from Derby who is going to spend the next 5 decades either threatening to kill people or actually killing them, gliding across a dance floor in Philadelphia on a Saturday night, entirely happy. Then, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese Imperial Navy attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and the world changed. Frank Sheeran was 21 years old. He enlisted in the United States Army in August of 1941. Several months before Pearl Harbor, he had seen the way events were trending in Europe and felt the pull of something larger than himself. He completed basic training near Biloxi, Mississippi, and was initially assigned to the military police. After Pearl Harbor, the whole machinery of American military mobilization accelerated, and Sheeran volunteered for airborne training at Fort Benning, Georgia. He wanted to be a paratrooper, to jump out of aircraft and fight in the darkness. But at Fort Benning, he dislocated his shoulder during training, and that was the end of the airborne. He was transferred to the 45th Infantry Division, known by two nicknames that tell you everything you need to know about the unit's temperament: the Thunderbirds and the Killer Division. On July 14, 1943, Frank Sheeran set sail for North Africa. He was 22 years old, and he had never killed anyone by the time he came home. He had done it somewhere between 25 and 41 times, maybe more. He stopped keeping count. The Italian campaign of World War II is not the part of the war that gets the most attention in American popular memory. D-Day is what people know. The beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. The iconic photographs, the Hollywood films. But the Italian campaign was something else entirely. Slower, bloodier, more grinding and personal than almost any other theater of the entire war. The 45th Infantry Division landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943. As part of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of the island that would serve as the stepping stone to the Italian mainland. Sicily in the summer of 1943 was a beautiful place rendered into something close to hell. Ancient stone towns turned into rubble by artillery, olive groves cut down by machine gun fire, the Mediterranean sun blazing down on men who were learning very quickly which of their number were going to survive this war and which were not. Frank Sheeran survived Sicily. He came through it changed, quieter in ways he could not explain, louder in others, and then he came ashore at Salerno in September 1943, in a landing that was supposed to be the knockout blow and turned into something close to catastrophe. The Germans had anticipated the assault and had prepared accordingly. The beachhead at Salerno held only by the thinnest margin, with American and British troops pinned against the water for days, while German counterattacks came in wave after wave. Men were dying around Frank Sheeran in large numbers and in graphic ways. And the Frank Sheeran who had arrived in Sicily 3 months earlier as a reasonably intact young man from Derby, Pennsylvania, was being systematically disassembled by experience. Then there was Anzio. The Battle of Anzio lasted from January 22nd to June 5th, 1944, and it was one of the most brutal, sustained, psychologically destructive episodes of the entire Second World War. The Allied landing was intended to break the stalemate of the Italian campaign, to land behind the German lines and outflank them, forcing a rapid advance toward Rome. What happened instead was that the Germans encircled the beachhead and pinned the Allied forces down for 4 months in an area roughly 8 miles deep and 15 miles wide, subjecting them to constant artillery, air raids, and infantry attacks. Men lived in foxholes for weeks at a time. The mud was constant. The sound of German shells was constant. The dying was constant. Frank Sheeran spent time at Anzio, and he brought something away from it that would define the rest of his life. He later described it to Charles Brandt with the direct simplicity of a man who had long since stopped trying to make the experience sound better than it was. The war, he said, taught him how to feel nothing when he killed. He said it was as though a switch had been installed somewhere inside him during those months of combat, a switch that he could throw at need. That cut the connection between the act of ending a human life and the emotional response that ordinary people would feel in doing so. He also participated in things that, under the laws of war, would have been prosecuted as atrocities. He was not alone in this. The chaos and brutality of the Italian campaign produced these incidents on both sides. And Frank Sheeran was not the only American soldier who came home carrying memories of things that had been done in the official service of the war, but were not, precisely, sanctioned by the rules of armed conflict. He described to Brandt several instances of summary executions, German prisoners of war being shot rather than processed, on orders that came down through the informal channels of men who had been fighting and dying for too long, and had developed a certain pragmatic attitude toward what the rules allowed. He described ordering prisoners to dig their own graves before shooting them. Brandt categorized these incidents into what he described as 4 different types of wartime killing that Sheeran had participated in, each requiring a different kind of internal accommodation, each leaving its own specific kind of damage. By the time Frank Sheeran had worked through all 4, he had learned something that no amount of peacetime criminal ambition could have taught him, something that made him uniquely valuable to the world he would eventually enter. He had learned that the psychological barrier between wanting someone dead and making them dead, a barrier that stops most human beings cold, was in him, permeable, crossable, at need, essentially transparent, while the average American soldier who saw combat in World War II served approximately 100 days in combat situations before being rotated out. Frank Sheeran served 411 days, more than 4 times the average. He did not do this because he was heroic, though he may have been brave. He did it because he was good at it, and because the Army recognized that he was good at it and kept finding uses for him. He moved through the Italian campaign, into the landings in southern France, into the march across Germany itself. He went AWOL 50 days in total, always for wine and women, he said, never during a period when his unit was heading back into combat, because the penalty for that was not a reprimand, but a bullet from your own officers. He understood this rule completely and respected it. He learned Italian during those years in the field, not classroom Italian, field Italian, the language of the streets and the markets, and the conversations a young American soldier has with the people whose country he is fighting through. He learned it well enough that it would later become one of his primary assets in his career with the Philadelphia Mafia. A world where the ability of a non-Italian to speak the language of the men around him was not just useful, but was, in a very specific way, a form of trust. On October 24, 1945, Private First Class Frank Sheeran was honorably discharged from the United States Army. He was 24 years old. He had served his country. He had done things that, in the official accounting, were things to be proud of. He went home to Philadelphia, and the mob didn't create a killer. It just found one. Coming home from a war is not one experience. It is many experiences, arriving at different speeds and different times. And the man who steps off the troop transport is not the same man who will exist in 3 months or 3 years. When certain things have had time to settle into him and become permanent, what Frank Sheeran knew, stepping back onto American soil in the fall of 1945, was that the civilian world looked very different from what it had looked like when he left it. Smaller, quieter, safer, and in that safety, somehow more foreign than the war zones he had spent the last 4 years in. He tried to build a normal life. He married a woman named Mary Letty, an Irish immigrant, his first wife, and they settled into the Philadelphia area and began raising a family. They would eventually have 3 daughters together, Mary Ann, Dolores, and Peggy. Frank took work as a truck driver for a supermarket chain called Food Fair, hauling freight along the routes that connected the warehouses and distribution centers of the northeastern United States. It was honest work, union work, the kind of work that millions of working-class American men were doing in the late 1940s and early 1950s. On the surface, it looked like normalcy. A house, a wife, children, A steady paycheck. The American promise delivered as advertised. Underneath the surface, Frank Sheeran was restless in a way he could not fully articulate and did not entirely understand. The war had recalibrated his nervous system. The pace of civilian life, the repetitive routine of truck routes and paychecks and neighborhood social obligations, felt to him like a kind of slow suffocation. He was a man who had spent 4 years operating at the absolute edge of human intensity, and the ordinary world did not go anywhere near that edge. The money he made driving trucks was not enough. The respect he received as a truck driver was not enough. The life he was living was not the life that the part of him shaped by Anzio and Sicily and the Rhine River wanted to live. He began supplementing his truck driver's income with what he called side work. This was the language men in his world used for things they did not discuss too loudly. The side work was, at first, simple muscle, collecting debts for local loan sharks in the Philadelphia area. Men who had borrowed money and were not repaying it would receive a visit from Frank Sheeran, and the visit generally resolved the issue. He was good at this. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed well over 200 pounds, and he had a certain quality in his presence, a stillness, a willingness to allow silence to do its work. It communicated to most people, very efficiently, that the conversation they were about to have with him was one they should take seriously. He was arrested in the late 1940s after beating 2 men during an altercation on a trolley in Philadelphia. The charges did not stick, but the incident confirmed what the people around him were beginning to understand. Frank Sheeran was not a man with whom you had minor disagreements. The side work expanded. He began stealing from his truck shipments. Not small amounts, not petty pilfering, but systematic theft of high-value cargo, primarily meat, which he then sold to buyers who did not ask questions. The principal buyer was a local Philadelphia mobster named Felix DiTullio, known as Whispers, a man associated with the Philadelphia crime family, which operated under the authority of Angelo Bruno and the broader structure of La Cosa Nostra in the northeastern United States. It was petty by the standards of what Sheeran would later be involved in, but it was a door. And the most important thing about a door is not how large it is what is on the other side. In 1955, Frank Sheeran's truck broke down somewhere in upstate New York during a delivery run. He was standing by the side of the road, dealing with the problem the way truck drivers deal with mechanical problems, with a combination of technical knowledge, physical effort, and bad language, when a short, older Italian man walked up to him and offered to help. The man was soft-spoken. He was perhaps in his 50s, compact and unremarkable in appearance, dressed conservatively. He had calm eyes and the kind of quiet authority that does not announce itself, but simply occupies the air around it. He said, simply, that he saw a man having trouble and wanted to give him a hand. His name was Russell Bufalino. If you were standing on a street corner in northeastern Pennsylvania in 1955, and you said the name Russell Bufalino, the response you received from the people who knew the landscape of American organized crime would have been immediate and unmistakable. Bufalino was the boss of the Bufalino crime family, based in the northeastern Pennsylvania city of Pittston, with territory that extended across Pennsylvania into upstate New York, New Jersey, and Florida. He was not a flashy man. He was, in fact, the opposite of flashy. He drove ordinary cars. He dressed without ostentation. He ran a legitimate business as the owner of the Pennsylvania Garment Company. And he made no public statements about anything, ever. He had the quality, prized above almost anything else in the world he inhabited, of invisibility. The FBI knew who he was and what he did, but for years and years they could not build a case against him because Russell Bufalino left almost no evidence of anything. He was also, by the accounting of people who knew him, One of the most genuinely dangerous men in the organized crime landscape of mid-century America. Not dangerous in the way of men who lose their temper and make examples. Dangerous in the cold, deliberate, absolute way of someone who decided things clearly and executed those decisions without hesitation and without sentiment. When Russell Bufalino wanted something to happen, it happened. Frank Sheeran and Russell Bufalino fixed the truck together, and something clicked between them, a recognition, mutual and immediate, of what the other man was. Two men who did not frighten easily, who had both learned early that the world operated according to a different set of rules than the ones printed in the law books, who understood violence not as aberration but as instrument. They exchanged information. They made arrangements to meet again. Sheeran began doing small jobs for Bufalino, driving him places, making deliveries, being present at meetings where the boss might need someone large and dependable nearby. The jobs got bigger and more specific and more violent. And Frank Sheeran did them all with the same steady competence he brought to everything. Bufalino, who was not a man given to excess praise, recognized what he had found in the closed world of La Cosa Nostra, where membership was reserved by blood for men of pure Italian heritage. Frank Sheeran would never be a made member of the family, but he could be something almost as valuable, a trusted associate with no formal ties, which meant no formal exposure, who did exceptional work and kept his mouth absolutely shut. Frank Sheeran later described Russell Bufalino as one of the two greatest men he had ever met in his life. The affection was genuine, born not of sentiment, but of the specific intimacy that develops between men in dangerous situations. When someone has vouched for you and protected you and trusted you with things that could get both of you killed. Through Bufalino, Sheeran also connected with Bufalino's cousin, an attorney named Bill Bufalino. Bill Bufalino was one of the most important union lawyers in the northeastern United States. He represented the Teamsters and their leadership through the 1950s and 1960s, going to court again and again on behalf of the union and the men who ran it. It was Bill Bufalino who had gotten Frank Sheeran off on the theft charges from his truck driving days, and it was through Bill Bufalino that the web of connections between Sheeran and the larger world of organized labor and organized crime would eventually become visible. But before any of that, there was the question of the first real job, the first murder. It came about through a man named Whispers DiTullio, the same mobster to whom Frank had been selling stolen meat from his food fare deliveries. DiTullio approached Sheeran with a proposition: burn down a company called Cadillac Linen Service, a commercial laundry operation in Delaware that supplied tablecloths and napkins to restaurants. The money for the job was $10,000, which was substantial money in the mid-1950s. Frank agreed. What Sheeran did not know, and what DiTullio either did not know or did not see fit to mention, was that Angelo Bruno, the boss of the Philadelphia crime family, one of the most powerful mafia figures in the eastern United States, had a significant financial stake in Cadillac Linen Service. The mob had interests in the commercial laundry business across the Northeast, and this particular business was connected to Bruno's operation. Frank Sheeran was spotted casing the laundry. He was identified, and word traveled, as word always travels in that world, very quickly upward. Within a remarkably short time, Frank Sheeran was being escorted to a meeting with Angelo Bruno in an Italian restaurant in Manhattan. Picture this moment. Frank Sheeran is 30-something years old, a truck driver, a man who has done violent things in service of loan sharks and small-time mobsters. He walks into a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan and sits down across from a man who runs an organization that has killed people for considerably less than what Sheeran has done. Bruno does not raise his voice. Men like Angelo Bruno never raise their voice. The voice stays level, calm, almost gentle, and what comes out of it is something much more frightening than anger. It is clarity. Bruno explains that Frank Sheeran was about to make a very serious mistake. Bruno explains that the laundry business is connected to his interests. Bruno explains that because Russell Bufalino has vouched for Sheeran, and because Russell Bufalino's word carries considerable weight with Bruno, Sheeran is not going to suffer the usual consequences of this kind of carelessness. Instead, there is an opportunity for Sheeran to demonstrate that he understands the cost of his error, and that he is the kind of man who pays his debts. The cost is Whispers to Tullio. You gotta do what you gotta do, Bruno tells him. Frank Sheeran went back to Philadelphia. The next morning, Whispers de Tullio was found dead, shot at close range with a .32 caliber pistol. The newspapers noted the killing. The police noted the killing. Nobody was ever charged. Frank Sheeran's career as a Mafia enforcer had officially begun. Before we can talk about what happened between Frank Sheeran and Jimmy Hoffa, we have to talk about Jimmy Hoffa himself. Because Jimmy Hoffa was not simply a character in Frank Sheeran's story. He was, in the mid-20th century, one of the most consequential figures in American public life. A man whose power at its peak was genuinely comparable to that of presidents and senators, and whose fall was one of the great cautionary tales of an era defined by the collision between ambition and corruption. James Riddle Hoffa was born on February 14, 1913, in Brazil. Indiana, a small coal mining town in the western part of the state that was, in the early 20th century, the kind of place where the mines and the men who worked them were locked in a permanent, brutal negotiation about who owned the lives of the workers. His father, John Cleveland Hoffa, was a coal driller who died of a respiratory illness when Jimmy was 7 years old, leaving his mother, Viola, with 4 children and no income in a country that was going to do nothing whatsoever to help them. The Hoffa family moved to Clinton, Indiana, and then to Detroit, Michigan, pulled there. As so many families were in the early 1920s, by the automobile industry that was transforming the city into the industrial capital of the world. Detroit in the 1920s was a boomtown, loud, fast, dangerous, and full of men making more money than their fathers had ever imagined possible. It was also, by the early 1930s, a city in which the Great Depression had created absolute economic catastrophe. As the auto industry contracted, and men who had been making good wages were suddenly competing for any work at all. Jimmy Hoffa quit school in the 9th grade. He and Frank Sheeran had this in common: to go to work. He was 14 years old. He worked in a Detroit department store, and then he got a job at Kroger's warehouse, loading and unloading railroad cars of groceries in the brutal heat of the Michigan summers and the ice-cold winters. The work was backbreaking, the pay was minimal, and the supervisors treated the workers with the casual contempt that comes from knowing that for every man in that warehouse, there are 50 more outside the door who want his job. This is where Jimmy Hoffa found his calling. He organized his coworkers. At 18 years old, in 1931, during the worst economic depression in American history, Jimmy Hoffa led a wildcat strike, an unauthorized, spontaneous work stoppage against Kroger's when the company tried to cut wages. The strike was perfectly timed. It happened when a truckload of strawberries arrived at the loading dock. Because perishables meant leverage, the company capitulated. Hoffa and his crew got their wages maintained. And Jimmy Hoffa discovered something about himself that would define every year of the remaining 44 years of his life. He discovered that the feeling of winning a fight, particularly a fight against someone with more power than you, was the closest thing he had ever felt to joy. He joined the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and began rising through its structure with a speed and efficiency that were, by any measure, extraordinary. He was not subtle about his methods. He organized workers with ferocious energy, traveled constantly across the Midwest, and then the entire country, building alliances with local union leaders, making deals with employers, and critically, making alliances with organized crime figures who had both muscle and money, and who understood that the trucking industry, which moved the vast majority of goods across the United States, was a prize worth fighting for. By the mid-1950s, Jimmy Hoffa had become a figure of national significance. He was a short, stocky, relentlessly energetic man who communicated the specific kind of authority that comes not from education or social position, but from the absolute, unambiguous willingness to fight. He had a fighter's build and a fighter's mind, constantly looking for angles, always calculating, always moving. He dressed conservatively by the standards of his associates and spoke without pretension, in the flat, direct cadences of the Detroit working class. He could walk into a room full of senators and make them feel nervous, because he had something most of them had never had, the knowledge that when things got rough, really rough, physically rough, he was not going to be the one who blinked first. In 1957, with the backing of the Mafia families that had become deeply embedded in the Teamsters structure, particularly through Hoffa's administration of the Union's Central States Pension Fund, which had become, under his stewardship, one of the most powerful financial instruments in American organized crime, Jimmy Hoffa was elected president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. The union had, at its peak, 2.5 million members. It controlled the movement of goods across the entire country. It had a pension fund that was measured in hundreds of millions of dollars, and those dollars were flowing through carefully arranged loans into the casino construction that was turning Las Vegas from a desert town into the entertainment capital of the world. The mob's bank was the Teamsters Pension Fund, and Jimmy Hoffa held the keys. Every major casino on the Las Vegas Strip in the 1960s, the Desert Inn, Caesar's Palace, the Stardust, the Dunes, the Circus had been financed, at least in part, with loans from the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. Hoffa's administrator for the fund was Allen Dorfman, whose stepfather had been a close associate of Al Capone in Chicago. The loans were made on terms that would have been insane in any conventional financial context. High risk, minimal collateral, interest that sometimes came back in the form of casino skim, which meant untaxed cash delivered in suitcases to Midwestern mob bosses who used it to fund their own organizations. The mob owned Las Vegas, and Hoffa's pension fund had helped them build it. Bobby Kennedy knew all of this. Robert Francis Kennedy had come to the Senate labor rackets committee hearings in 1957 as chief counsel. He was 31 years old, the son of one of the wealthiest men in America, Harvard-educated, relentlessly ambitious, and possessed of a moral certainty that had been sharpened rather than softened by his proximity to power. He was, in many ways, the exact opposite of Jimmy Hoffa, born to privilege, educated at elite institutions, connected to the corridors of power by blood and money. But Bobby Kennedy had chosen to point that privilege like a weapon at the corruption he saw in American labor. And Jimmy Hoffa was his primary target. The two men hated each other with a personal, visceral intensity that went beyond the professional. Kennedy saw Hoffa as the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the exercise of power without accountability, a man who had placed himself above the law while claiming to represent the working class. Hoffa saw Kennedy as a spoiled rich kid using his family's connections and his brother's political ambitions to persecute a labor movement that had done more for working-class Americans than the Kennedy family had ever done or ever would. Hoffa called Bobby Kennedy Booby, mocking, contemptuous, personal. They glared at each other across the Senate hearing room in televised confrontations that millions of Americans watched, and the hatred between them was palpable through the screen. Kennedy would not let it go. After his brother became president in 1961, and appointed Bobby as Attorney General. Robert Kennedy formed what became known in the Justice Department as the Get Hoffa Squad, a dedicated team of prosecutors and investigators whose explicit mission was to find evidence that would put Jimmy Hoffa in federal prison. It was prosecutorial warfare, and it was personal. The problem with waging prosecutorial warfare against someone like Jimmy Hoffa was that Hoffa had spent 20 years making himself difficult to touch. He had lawyers, he had connections, he had, on at least one occasion during the McClellan Committee hearings, managed to neutralize a grand jury through means that were not entirely legal. He had survived years of investigations. He had been acquitted of charges that should have put him away. But Bobby Kennedy was patient, and Bobby Kennedy had resources. And Bobby Kennedy was absolutely convinced that Jimmy Hoffa was going to prison. In 1957, Russell Bufalino decided that his favorite Irish enforcer needed a better class of employer. Frank Sheeran had, by this point, been working for the Bufalino family for approximately 2 years. He had done the kind of work that such organizations require, the violent, invisible, deniable work that keeps the machinery running without leaving fingerprints. He was trusted, he was capable, and now Russell Bufalino, who had been telling Jimmy Hoffa for some time about this remarkable Irish truck driver who could be relied upon absolutely, decided to make an introduction. The introduction came by telephone. Frank Sheeran was at home in Philadelphia when the phone rang, and the man on the other end of the line, without pleasantries, without preamble, simply and directly, said the words that would become perhaps the most famous greeting in the annals of American organized crime. "I heard you paint houses. In the world these men inhabited. To paint houses was to kill people. The paint was blood, specifically the blood that spatters on the walls and floors of a room. When someone is shot at close range, it was not standard mob slang. It was, according to the best available evidence, a phrase specific to the Bufalino family's northeastern Pennsylvania circle. But its meaning to a man in Frank Sheeran's position was entirely clear. Frank Sheeran later described the moment. He stammered slightly. He was, he said, caught off guard. And he answered, "Yeah, and I do my own carpentry too." Meaning, I not only kill, I also dispose of the evidence. Bodies in this world are the equivalent of what a carpenter's job produces in terms of mess. Waste product that needs to be managed and removed. There was a pause, and then Jimmy Hoffa laughed. Two men with the same fundamental understanding of the world, who spoke the same language beneath the language, who recognized in each other something true and useful and mutual. The two men had found each other, and the relationship that developed over the next 18 years would be the most important, and ultimately the most devastating of both their lives. The connection worked initially through Bufalino's vouching, but it quickly took on its own momentum. Hoffa needed enforcers, men who could do the specific kind of work that maintaining control of a massive, contentious, politically complex labor organization requires when legal and political means have been exhausted. Men who would deal with union dissidents who would not be persuaded. Men who would handle rival union officials who were making moves against Teamsters territory. Men who could deliver certain kinds of messages that could not be put in writing or spoken directly. Frank Sheeran was all of these things, and was uniquely also able to operate on the legitimate side of the Teamsters structure. He rose, over the following years, to become the acting president of Local 326 of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in Wilmington, Delaware. This gave him an official position, an official salary, official reasons to be present at union meetings and official functions, which served as cover for everything else he was doing. The relationship between Sheeran and Hoffa became something that transcended the employer-employee dynamic that it had begun as. These were two men who genuinely liked each other, who enjoyed each other's company, who shared a worldview, who both operated from the same fundamental conviction that the official rules were for people who did not have the toughness to operate outside them. Hoffa trusted Sheeran with things that he trusted almost nobody with, and Sheeran later said that Hoffa was one of the two greatest men he had ever met, the other being Russell Bufalino. The work was extensive and lethal. In the decade between their first conversation and Hoffa's imprisonment in 1967, Frank Sheeran later confessed to killing somewhere between 25 and 30 men on behalf of Hoffa and the Bufalino family combined. He said he could not remember the exact number with certainty, a detail that tells you something about the frequency of the work and something about the kind of psychological mechanism that a man needs to develop in order to perform it at that frequency and continue functioning. He had not become a different person. He had become a person who had compartmentalized the killing in a space that did not communicate with the space where he lived his daily life. He was, by the mid-1960s, one of the most powerful labor figures in the northeastern United States, with connections to virtually every major organized crime family in the country. In the early 1980s, then United States Attorney Rudy Giuliani, in a RICO prosecution, named Frank Sheeran as one of only 26 top organized crime figures in the country, and noted that Sheeran was one of only 2 men on the list who were not of Italian descent. In a world defined almost entirely by ethnic exclusivity, where Italian heritage was not merely preferred, but required for full membership in La Cosa Nostra, this was an acknowledgement of extraordinary distinction. Frank Sheeran had been granted, by the sheer weight of his usefulness and reliability, a status that no amount of money or ambition could otherwise purchase. Then there was the Bay of Pigs in 1961. The Central Intelligence Agency, in collaboration with a group of Cuban exiles trained and supported by the United States government, launched an invasion of Cuba intended to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro. The invasion took place at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961, and it failed completely and catastrophically, becoming one of the most embarrassing episodes in the history of American foreign policy. What is less widely known, or rather, what exists in the territory between the known and the suspected, where the mob-government relationships of the early Cold War tend to live, is the extent to which organized crime was involved in the logistical preparation for that invasion. According to Frank Sheeran's confession to Charles Brandt, he was ordered by both Hoffa and Bufalino to drive a truck from Baltimore to Florida in 1961 containing weapons intended for the anti-Castro forces. He said he met a man in Baltimore named David Ferry, a strange, deeply unsettling character who would later appear in various conspiracy theories surrounding the assassination of President Kennedy, who directed the operation. Ferry informed Sheeran that he was to deliver a trailer full of weapons, which had been taken from the Maryland National Guard's inventory, to a CI operative named E. Howard Hunt in Florida. Hunt was a veteran CIA officer who would, a decade later, become one of the central figures in the Watergate scandal. Sheeran completed the delivery. He described it as simply another job: drive a truck from point A to point B, deliver the cargo, return home. The fact that the cargo was weapons intended for a CI, a paramilitary operation against a foreign government, and that the man who gave him the instructions was connected to what would later be investigated as one of the most controversial government operations in American history, did not, by his account, particularly impress him at the time. It was just a job. This aspect of Sheeran's story, the Bay of Pigs connection, has been neither confirmed nor definitively disproven. David Ferry was real. E. Howard Hunt was real. The CIS use of organized crime, connections in its anti-Castro operations, is documented historical fact. The agency had approached mob bosses including Santos, Trafficante, and Sam Giancana, about the possibility of assassinating Castro, offers that were made and seriously considered, that the mob's trucking and logistics infrastructure might have been used for weapons transport in the run-up to the Bay of Pigs invasion is not implausible. It is simply unverified. What it illustrates is the extraordinary degree to which the lines between organized crime, legitimate labor, and American government power had blurred by the early 1960s. Jimmy Hoffa's Teamsters were not simply a labor union. They were a financial and logistical network that connected the legitimate economy with the shadow economy of organized crime, and that connection extended, at points, into the operations of the United States government itself. On November 22, 1963, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The Warren Commission, which investigated the assassination, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. That conclusion has been contested, argued over, and rejected by a substantial portion of the American public ever since. And conspiracy theories involving the Mafia, the CIA, Cuban exiles, and various combinations thereof been proposed, investigated, and debated for more than 60 years. Frank Sheeran's contribution to this conversation was characteristically direct. He claimed, though he was careful, even in his confessions, about the precise boundaries of what he said he knew, that Jimmy Hoffa believed the assassination of John Kennedy was ordered by organized crime, specifically motivated by the desire to remove Robert Kennedy from the position of Attorney General. Bobby Kennedy's crusade against Hoffa and against organized crime more broadly was, in this view, something that the Mafia leadership had decided needed to end, and the surest way to end it was to eliminate the source of Bobby Kennedy's power, which was his brother's presidency. Sheeran also claimed to have driven a truck that may have contained weapons connected to the assassination. He was careful to frame this as indirect knowledge. He did not claim to have been present in Dallas, did not claim direct participation in any plot, but the weapons he described transporting as part of the Bay of Pigs logistics, and the possibility that some of those weapons or related materials ended up in different hands for different purposes. This is the shadow that Sheeran cast over one of the most debated crimes in American history. What happened in Dallas on November 22, 1963, is something about which the full truth may never be known. What is certain is that when Jimmy Hoffa heard that the president had been shot, his reaction was not that of a grieving American. Robert Kennedy's mission to destroy Hoffa died that day, or so Hoffa believed. The Get Hoffa squad lost its most powerful champion. But the cases Bobby Kennedy had built were already in motion. The legal machinery, once set in motion, does not simply stop because the man who wound the spring has been removed. In 1964, the chickens that Robert Kennedy had been so patiently chasing finally came home to roost. Jimmy Hoffa was convicted twice, in separate trials, of jury tampering in Tennessee and of mail and wire fraud related to the improper use of the Teamsters pension fund in Chicago. He appealed both convictions through every available avenue, all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld them. On March 7, 1967, Jimmy Hoffa walked into the federal penitentiary at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, to begin serving an aggregate sentence of 13 years. Before he went in, he did two things that would have enormous consequences for everything that followed. First, he refused to resign from the Teamsters presidency. He kept the title, maintained his position technically, and made clear that he intended to continue running the union from prison to whatever extent was possible. Second, he installed a man named Frank Fitzsimmons as acting president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Fitzsimmons was, by the unanimous assessment of everyone who knew the Teamsters world, not an impressive figure. He was amiable, politically cautious, unimaginative, and exactly what Hoffa wanted in a placeholder, a man who would keep the seat warm without trying to sit in it permanently. Hoffa's plan was to run the Union from Louisburg through Fitzsimmons, to maintain his power at a remove till he could be released and resume direct control. It was one of the great miscalculations of Jimmy Hoffa's life. Frank Sheeran's world shifted dramatically with Hoffa's imprisonment. His primary patron was gone, his loyalties, always divided between Hoffa and Bufalino, with Bufalino holding the prior claim, now had to be rebalanced entirely toward the Philadelphia mob boss and his world. Sheeran continued working. He continued doing the things he did. He continued running Local 326 in Wilmington. He continued being available when Bufalino or the Philadelphia family needed something done. But the warmth was gone from the center of his professional world. The warmth that had come from Jimmy Hoffa's particular energy and the specific friendship that had existed between them. Frank Sheeran had not had many genuine friendships in his life. The war had made those hard to form and harder to keep. But what existed between him and Hoffa was real. It was built on mutual respect and mutual usefulness and a shared willingness to live without pretending that the world was a better place than it actually was. With Hoffa gone, that relationship went into a kind of stasis. And while it was in stasis, the world it had existed in continued to change in ways that, slowly but unmistakably, would eventually make that relationship impossible to maintain. Frank Fitzsimmons, the amiable placeholder whom Jimmy Hoffa had installed as acting Teamsters president, did what placeholders should never do, but occasionally do when given enough time and enough power. He began to enjoy himself. The presidency of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in 1967 was not a small thing. It came with a salary, a staff, connections to power and money across the entire spectrum of American economic life. It came with the goodwill of organized crime families who found Fitzsimmons considerably easier to manage than Hoffa, less volatile, less demanding, less likely to make political calculations that cut against the mob's interests in favor of his own ego. Fitzsimmons was compliant in ways that Hoffa had never been. The mob could work with Fitzsimmons. And so, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the people who had formed the support structure of Jimmy Hoffa's power began to realign themselves. The Mafia families that had backed Hoffa because he was useful began backing Fitzsimmons because he was more useful, or at least more manageable. The political connections that had been Hoffa's began to become Fitzsimmons's. The pension fund continued to flow into mob enterprises across the country, but now it flowed through a man who was grateful for the access and not inclined to make difficulties. In December 1971, after serving approximately 4.5 years of his 13-year sentence, Jimmy Hoffa's prison term was commuted by President Richard Nixon. The commutation was controversial, deeply controversial, with many observers believing that it represented a political quid pro quo between the Nixon administration and the Teamsters leadership. The Teamsters had endorsed Nixon for re-election in 1972, breaking with their traditional support for Democratic candidates in a move that was unusual enough to attract attention. Whether the commutation and the endorsement were formally connected, or whether they were two independent transactions that happened to produce the same political results for the same political actors, is something that has never been definitively established. What was definitively established were the terms of the commutation. Nixon's Justice Department attached a condition to Hoffa's early release. He was barred from participating in union organizing or union activities until 1980. The condition was almost certainly arranged at the request of Fitzsimmons and his mob-aligned backers, who wanted the assurance of knowing that Hoffa could not simply walk out of Louisburg and immediately begin the process of reclaiming his union. The restriction gave them time. Hoffa, at 58 years old, walked out of federal prison and back into a world that had reorganized itself in his absence. And he was furious. During the years that Hoffa spent in Louisburg, Frank Sheeran continued to be a man of considerable violence and considerable legal peril. In 1972, he was charged with a 1967 murder, the killing of a man named Robert Degeog, who had died in a shootout in front of the headquarters of Teamsters Local 107. The case was dismissed on the grounds that Sheeran had been denied a speedy trial, which is the kind of technical legal victory that serves as a reminder that the difference between going to prison and not going to prison frequently has nothing to do with whether you did the thing you are accused of. He was also alleged to have been involved in multiple other killings during this period, including the conspiracy to murder a Philadelphia labor organizer named Francis J. Marino in 1976, and the killing of a man named Frederick John Gavronsky in a tavern in Newcastle, Delaware. That same year, he escaped prosecution in these cases as well, through the combination of insufficient evidence, witness reluctance, and the considerable legal firepower that Russell Bufalino and the Philadelphia family could deploy on behalf of their people. And then there was April 7th, 1972, the birthday party at Umberto's Clam House. Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo was a New York mobster who had been, for most of his adult life, one of the more genuinely strange figures in the landscape of American organized crime. He was born in 1929 in Red Hook, Brooklyn, a neighborhood that produced hard men with the reliability of a factory, and he had grown up in a family already embedded in the criminal world. His brothers Larry and Albert were also in the life. Joe Gallo himself was, by the time he reached his late 20s, a genuinely dangerous person with the additional quality of being genuinely unpredictable, which in the mob is either an asset or a liability, depending entirely on whose unpredictability it is. He had earned his nickname Crazy Joe through a calculated performance of instability. He had studied the 1947 noir film Kiss of Death and modeled his public persona on that film's giggling, terrifying villain, correctly intuiting that a reputation for craziness would give him leverage that ordinary toughness would not. He was also genuinely something of an intellectual by mob standards. He read widely during his 10 years in prison, where he served time for extortion, and he came out of prison in 1971 with a broadened worldview that expressed itself in ways that the traditional mob leadership found deeply unsettling. Most significantly, Gallo had developed, during his prison years, close relationships with black organized crime figures. He had concluded that the racial exclusivity of the Italian-American mob was both morally wrong and strategically foolish, and he had begun building alliances across racial lines that no one in La Cosa Nostra had previously thought to build. This was radical. This was threatening to the established order. And in the world of organized crime, threats to the established order have a way of being resolved with extreme prejudice. On the evening of April 6, 1972, his 43rd birthday, Joe Gallo went out on the town in New York. He visited the Copacabana nightclub with his new wife, Sina, his stepdaughter Lisa, his sister Carmilla, and his bodyguard Pete the Greek Diapoulos. At the Copa, comedian Doe Rickles was performing, and the party enjoyed the show. After the Copa closed, around 4 in the morning, the Gallo party was looking for somewhere to eat. They tried several restaurants in Chinatown and Little Italy, all closed. Wandering through the pre-dawn streets of Lower Manhattan, they came upon a small clam house on the corner of Mulberry Street and Hester Street in Little Italy. Umberto's Clam House, which had opened only recently and was, as it happened, owned by a mob-connected operator named Matthew Matty the Horse, Ianiello. They went in, they were seated, they ordered, and somewhere in the next few minutes, word reached the people who wanted Crazy Joe Gallo dead that he was at Umberto's. What happened next is one of the genuinely contested events that make the Sheeran story so difficult to resolve with certainty. In Frank Sheeran's confession to Charles Brandt, confirmed by him in Brandt's book, and according to Brandt, by a woman who had been present at Umberto's that night and later became an editor at the New York Times, Sheeran was the shooter. He was sent by Russell Bufalino, triggered by an insult that Gallo had apparently made at the Copa earlier that evening. He walked into Umberto's alone, approached the table, shot Gallo's driver first, and then followed Gallo as he scrambled for the side door of the restaurant, shooting him multiple times in the street outside. Crazy Joey Gallo went to Australia on his birthday, Sheeran told Brandt, using the mob's word for death, on a bloody city sidewalk, the story told by other investigators, witnesses, and mob-connected sources is significantly different. The dominant theory, supported by eyewitness accounts from Gallo's own bodyguard, from Gallo's sister Carmilla, and from a mob associate named Joseph Luparelli, who surrendered to the FBI shortly after the killing, is that the shooter was Carmine Sonny Pinto DiBiase, a Genovese crime family soldier who was acting under orders from the Colombo family leadership as retaliation for Gallo's alleged role in the 1971 shooting of Colombo boss Joe Colombo. Diopoulos, who was present and who exchanged gunfire with the attackers, identified DiBiase specifically. Carmela Gallo described the shooters as short Italian men, not particularly fitting the profile of a 6'4" Irish-Swedish truck driver from Philadelphia. The woman who identified Sheeran as the shooter was anonymous, and the FBI ballistics evidence and eyewitness consistency supported DiBiase more strongly than Sheeran Jerry Capesi, a respected journalist and recognized expert on the New York mob who was at Umberto's shortly after the shooting as a young reporter for the New York Post, later wrote that if he were forced to choose, he thought Sheeran was the most likely person, but he was not certain. The Joe Gallo killing sits at the heart of the larger question that the Sheeran story raises about itself. How much of what Frank Sheeran told Charles Brandt was true, and how much of it was the construction of a dying man who wanted to be remembered as more central to the great crimes of his era than he actually was. The Gallo case is not clear enough in the evidence to settle the question. And the Hoffa case, the case that made everything else in the Sheeran story matter, is even murkier. Jimmy Hoffa came out of Lewisburg in December 1971 with a fire in him that years of federal incarceration had, if anything, intensified rather than diminished. He was 58 years old, and he was not going to quietly retire. He was going to get his union back. He was going to challenge the restriction on his union activities in court. He was going to rebuild his network of support. He was going to make it absolutely clear to everyone who had profited from his absence that his absence was over. He had allies. He had money. He had received a $1, 75 million lump sum pension settlement from the Teamsters upon his release, equivalent to approximately $13 million in contemporary value. He had relationships across the labor world and the organized crime world that years of prison had not erased. He was, despite the restrictions, still a figure of enormous symbolic weight. Truck drivers who had seen their wages and benefits improve dramatically during his presidency remembered who had done that for them. But he also had enemies, powerful enemies who had spent 4.5 years building a world that worked better for them with Jimmy Hoffa in Lewisburg, and who were not enthusiastic about seeing him return. Frank Fitzsimmons was one. Fitzsimmons had long since stopped pretending that he was a placeholder. He had a full staff, a full salary, full access to the pension fund, and full relationships with all the mob-connected figures who had previously dealt with Hoffa. He had no intention of going back to whatever he had been before, and he was prepared to use whatever influence he had to make sure that Hoffa's restrictions were maintained. Anthony Provenzano was another. Tony Pro was a piece of work, simultaneously a Teamsters official. He had been a vice president of the union during Hoffa's presidency, running the New Jersey locals, and a capo in the Genovese crime family. He was brutal, politically shrewd, and deeply committed to maintaining the power structure that Hoffa's imprisonment had created. He and Hoffa had been friends before prison. In prison, at Lewisburg, where they were both serving time, they had had a violent falling out over pension money. Provenzano wanted pension benefits that Hoffa believed he was not entitled to under the circumstances. And Hoffa told him so, in characteristically blunt terms. Provenzano had threatened, in language that left nothing to the imagination, to kill Hoffa's grandchildren. After that, they were not friends. By 1974, with Hoffa actively campaigning to have his union restriction overturned and making no secret of his intention to challenge Fitzsimmons for the Teamsters presidency, the constellation of people who wanted Hoffa out of the picture had grown substantial. The Genovese family, the Chicago outfit, multiple Midwest mob figures who had built comfortable arrangements with Fitzsimmons and did not want them disturbed. Even certain elements of the Bufalino family had come to prefer the current arrangement. And at some point in 1974, or early 1975, a decision was made. The decision was not made by one person or at one meeting. It emerged from the consensus of multiple powerful interests who had independently reached the same conclusion: that Jimmy Hoffa's continued presence in the world was a problem that was not going to solve itself, and that solutions existed. The men who made this decision were not men who said these things out loud in rooms where they might be recorded. They said them in the way that men in their world communicated important decisions, through implication, through misdirection, through conversations that could not be directly quoted because they did not directly say anything. But the decision traveled through the network, and eventually it reached the man who had to be the one to carry it out. Frank Sheeran heard it from Russell Bufalino, and the way he heard it was the worst possible way. In the summer of 1975, Russell Bufalino was planning to attend a wedding in Detroit, the wedding celebration of a young woman who was the daughter of Bill Bufalino, Russell's cousin and the longtime Teamsters attorney. It was the kind of family event that in the world of Italian-American mob families carried genuine emotional weight. Weddings were occasions for reunion, for the reinforcement of the bonds that held everything together, for the visible affirmation that the family, the literal family and the figurative one, was intact and strong. Russell and his wife Carrie were going to make the drive from northeastern Pennsylvania to Detroit in Russell's car. Frank Sheeran and his second wife, Irene Gray, he had divorced Mary Letty in 1968 and married Irene, with whom he had a daughter named Connie, were going to accompany them on the trip. 4 people in a car, driving west through the summer landscape of the American Northeast. Attending a wedding, this is the image that makes what happened next so disturbing. Not the violence itself, which in the world of Frank Sheeran and Russell Bufalino was a familiar instrument, but the setting, a family road trip, wives present, ordinary social occasion, and the business that had to be conducted inside that setting. They stopped overnight at a motel somewhere along the route. The wives, Carrie Bufalino and Irene Sheeran, went to one room. Russell and Frank went to another. And in that room, just the two of them. A motel room somewhere off a highway in the summer of 1975. Russell Bufalino told Frank Sheeran what this trip was actually about. The Hoffa thing has been sanctioned. Those words, or words equivalent to them. The Commission, the governing body of American organized crime, the Council of Bosses from New York and Chicago and other cities, had approved the killing of Jimmy Hoffa. The decision had been made at the highest possible level. It was not reversible. It was not negotiable. And Frank was the one who had to do it. Sheeran later described sitting in that motel room and understanding several things simultaneously, each of them terrible in its own specific way. He understood that he had no choice, not in the sense of lacking physical freedom, but in the sense that refusing an order of this kind sanctioned at this level, in this world, carried only one possible consequence. He understood that the man he was being ordered to kill was not a stranger, not an abstraction, not someone whose life was easy to end because it represented nothing personal. He understood that Jimmy Hoffa had trusted him for 18 years, with the specific trust that comes from having saved each other from various disasters and from having maintained, through all of it, a consistent mutual loyalty. He understood that this trust, this friendship, this history, none of it mattered. In the world he had chosen, loyalties had a hierarchy, and the hierarchy was absolute. You were loyal to your boss first. Everything else was second. Everything. Frank Sheeran said later that he felt nothing. He described it in the same terms he had used to describe how he had learned to feel nothing during the Battle of Anzio. The same internal mechanism, the same switch. He looked at what he was being asked to do, and he found the place inside himself where the switch was, and he threw it, and then it was just a job. Whether that is entirely true, or whether it is the story a man tells himself in the years afterward, when the alternative is to live with the full weight of what he did. That is a question that only Frank Sheeran could answer. And he is dead. Bufalino arranged for Frank to separate from the group. The wives would continue to Detroit in Bufalino's car. Frank would travel alone, by small plane from a private airstrip in Port Clinton, Ohio, where Bufalino dropped him off, to Detroit. When he landed in Detroit, he was met by a man named Salvatore Briguglio, known as Sally Bugs, one of Anthony Provenzano's people. They waited together, Frank and Sally Bugs. For the arrival of the car was driven by Charles Chucky O'Brien. This fact is one of the most heartbreaking details in the entire Hoffa story, because Chucky O'Brien was Jimmy Hoffa's foster son. Not a legal adoption, but as close as makes no difference. Hoffa had taken O'Brien in when the boy was young, had treated him as a son, had given him a place and a role in the Teamsters world. Whatever O'Brien understood about what he was participating in on July 30th, 1975, whatever his full knowledge of the plan was, he was the person whose presence in that car would make Jimmy Hoffa feel safe enough to get into it. And that is exactly what happened. Jimmy Hoffa arrived at the Machu's Red Fox parking lot in his own car, driving from his lake house in Orion Township, Michigan. He had stopped on the way at the Pontiac office of his friend Louis Linteau, a former Teamsters local president who now ran a limousine service. He told Linteau he was going to a meeting and he would check in later. He arrived at the restaurant. He waited. He called Linteau from a payphone at approximately 2:30 p.m. to say that the people he was waiting for had not yet arrived. He called Josephine, his wife, around 3:30 p.m. from the same payphone. He told her he was tired of waiting and was coming home. That phone call lasted a matter of minutes. It was the last conversation anyone outside the mob ever had with Jimmy Hoffa. At some point between 3 o'clock and 4 p.m., the precise timing has been debated for 50 years. The maroon Mercury pulled into the parking lot of the Machu's Red Fox. The car belonged to Anthony Giacaloni's son. Inside were Chucky O'Brien, Salvatore Briguglio, and Frank Sheeran. When Hoffa saw the car pull in, he was angry, furious at the lateness, furious at the disrespect. When he saw Frank Sheeran step out, his anger shifted. Here was someone he knew. Here was someone he trusted. Frank would explain. Frank would tell him what was going on. Sheeran later described Hoffa's face in that moment, the flash of recognition. And then something else, something beneath the recognition, some older instinct that sent a signal that did not make it to consciousness before it, was overridden by 18 years of established trust. Hoffa looked at Briguglio. He did not know this man. "What the F are you doing here?" he demanded of O'Brien. "Who the F invited you?" This was directed at his foster son, at the stranger standing next to him. Briguglio answered simply, "I'm with Tony Pro," His friends wanted to be at the thing. They're at the house waiting. And here is the terrible logic that made Jimmy Hoffa walk to that car and get into it. If Russell Bufalino were going to hurt him, Russell Bufalino would not be at a house waiting for him. Russell Bufalino was the closest thing Hoffa had to a protector in the organized crime world. The message that Bufalino was waiting at the house, that Russell wanted this peace meeting to happen, was exactly the message that would override the instinct that had fired somewhere in Hoffa's gut when he saw that car pull in. He got into the car. They drove through the streets of suburban Detroit. West toward the city, they drove to Beaverland Street. On Detroit's west side, a house that had been selected in advance, that was empty. That would leave no trace, because there was nothing there to leave a trace of no owner present. No witness, no record. O'Brien stopped the car in front of the house. Bergoglio stayed in the car or stepped away. Frank Sheeran and Jimmy Hoffa walked inside together. The house was empty. There was no Russell Bufalino. There was no Anthony Provenzano. There was no peace meeting, no negotiation. No future in which Jimmy Hoffa got his union back and lived out his years in the comfortable security of a man who had won his last fight. Hoffa realized it in that moment, standing in an empty house in Detroit in the summer of 1975. At 62 years old, with Frank Sheeran beside him, Jimmy Hoffa understood what was about to happen. Sheeran later said that Hoffa began to turn. That is all. He began to turn. Perhaps to run, perhaps to fight, perhaps simply to see, in the last fraction of a second available to him, the face of the man he had trusted for 18 years. Frank Sheeran raised the gun. 2 shots, the back of the head. Jimmy Hoffa, the most powerful labor leader in American history. The man who had built the Teamsters into a 2.5 million member colossus. The man who had stared down senators and presidents and the entire Kennedy family. The man who had survived federal prison and come out fighting, died in an empty house in Detroit with no witness and no ceremony. Frank Sheeran walked out of the house. He got into the car. He was driven away. Sheeran said he was told later that Hoffa's body was cremated, that the people who had arranged all of this had also arranged for there to be nothing left behind. No body, no grave, no evidence. Jimmy Hoffa simply ceased to exist. One moment he was in the world, and then he was not. And everything that remained of him was the telephone call to his wife from a parking lot payphone telling her he was tired of waiting and was coming home. He was officially declared legally dead on July 30th, 1982, exactly 7 years after his disappearance. His body has never been found. On that evening of July 30th, 1975, Frank Sheeran flew back from Detroit. He reconnected with Bufalino and their wives. They attended the wedding in Detroit. Frank Sheeran danced at the wedding, whether he was good at it, as he had been at the dance halls of Philadelphia 30 years earlier, is not recorded. What is recorded? In the FBI surveillance logs and the investigations that followed is that within a year, Frank Sheeran's name appeared on the list of suspects maintained by lead FBI investigator Robert Garrity. In a 1976 memo, Garrity's preliminary investigation identified Sheeran as Francis Joseph Frank Sheeran, age 43, President Local 326, Wilmington, Delaware, resides in Philadelphia, and is known associate of Russell Bufalino, La Cosa Nostra chief, Eastern Pennsylvania. The FBI was looking, but looking and finding are different things. And Frank Sheeran was, whatever else he was, a man who understood the difference between being a suspect and being charged. The years after Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance were not kind to Frank Sheeran. Not immediately, not in the dramatic way of a sudden collapse. The collapse was slow. The kind that happens when the structures that supported a man's position in the world begin to be dismantled one piece at a time. Hoffa was gone. Russell Bufalino the man who had protected Sheeran for 20 years, was himself coming under increasing federal pressure. The political and legal landscape of organized crime in the United States was shifting dramatically in the mid to late 1970s. As the Justice Department deployed increasingly sophisticated investigative tools, including the RICO statute, which had been enacted in 1970 and which allowed prosecutors to charge entire organizations rather than just individual criminals. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, changed everything about how the government pursued organized crime. Under RICO, the government did not need to prove that you personally pulled the trigger on a specific crime. It needed to prove that you were part of an enterprise that engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity. For men like Frank Sheeran, who had spent decades operating at the intersection of legitimate union work and criminal enforcement, RICO was the worst possible development. Russell Bufalino was convicted in 1978 of extortion and conspiracy. He was sent to federal prison, where he would eventually die in 1994 at the age of 90. His crime family continued to exist, but its most powerful protections were gone. Frank Sheeran continued to be investigated. The FBI had been building a case for years, using informants, surveillance recordings, and the patient accumulation of evidence that characterized the post-RICO federal prosecution strategy. The key informant was a man named Charles Allen, who had been a hitman and mob associate in his own right, and who, under pressure from federal authorities, agreed to cooperate. Allen claimed to have been paid by Sheeran for 2 murders and 3 attempted murders. Allen recorded approximately 50 conversations with Sheeran in the late 1970s. In 1980, after a federal trial in which the government's case relied heavily on Allen's testimony and those recorded conversations, Frank Sheeran was convicted on 11 counts of labor racketeering. The charges involved running a criminal scheme that defrauded Teamsters members, using union funds and resources for criminal purposes, corrupting the labor organization that he had nominally served in official capacity for decades. He was sentenced to 32 years in federal prison. He was 59 years old. He had been, according to then U.S. Attorney Rudy Giuliani's RICO designation, one of the 26 most significant organized crime figures in the United States. He had been named alongside the bosses and underbosses of the New York families, the Chicago outfit, the Philadelphia family, the leadership tier of American organized crime in the 20th century. He was one of 2 non-Italians on that list. The other was, apparently, a unique distinction that even Giuliani acknowledged in court papers. The conviction effectively ended Frank Sheeran's active life. He was going to spend the rest of his working years in federal prison. The world he had inhabited, the world of union halls and mob dinners and cross-country drives with Russell Bufalino, was over. He served 13 years. He was released in the early 1990s on medical grounds, at an age and in a physical condition that made him no longer a realistic threat to anyone. He was assisted in obtaining his early parole by a medical malpractice lawyer and former Delaware homicide prosecutor named Charles Brandt, who had been retained by the Philadelphia mob to facilitate Sheeran's release. Brandt had previously served as the first state's chief deputy attorney general. He had been a serious prosecutor, not a mob mouthpiece, but he had moved into private practice and taken criminal defense clients. And this particular client had been introduced to him by people associated with the Bufalino world. Brandt got Sheeran out, and the friendship that formed between them in the process, between the retired hitman and the retired prosecutor, 2 men who understood the machinery of law and violence from opposite ends, would eventually produce the most significant criminal confession in American history, or the most sophisticated fabrication, the question of which is still, 30 years later, unresolved. There is something deeply specific about the quality of silence that surrounds very old, very ill men who have done terrible things. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of resolution. It is the silence of a man who has been carrying something so heavy for so long that the carrying has become the entire substance of his days. And the weight is the thing that proves he is still alive. And he is terrified of what will happen when he finally puts it down. Frank Sheeran was released from federal prison in the early 1990s and moved into a nursing home in Westchester, Pennsylvania. He was in his 70s. He had cancer. He had arthritis so severe that it had robbed him of most of his mobility. The enormous physical presence that had made him so effective at his work, the 6 feet 4 inches, the 200+ pounds, the stillness that communicated more than most men's words, had been diminished by age and illness into something more ordinary. He was an old man in a nursing home, and the world he had moved through was mostly gone. His family did not know what he had done. His daughter Dolores, one of his 3 daughters by his first wife Mary, would later describe reading the manuscript of Charles, Brandt's book, and turning each page with growing horror. She did not want it to be true that her father had killed Jimmy Hoffa. She had loved her father in the complicated way that children love fathers who are not always present and not always safe and not always honest about the nature of their work in the world. She knew he had not been a saint. She had seen enough of his life to understand that it existed in a darkness she had not fully mapped. But this, the specificity of it, the betrayal of it, the detail of 2 bullets in the back of a friend's head, this was more than she had been prepared for. Sheeran gave Charles Brandt access to 5 years of recorded conversations. Over that period, from the mid-1990s to Sheeran's death in December 2003, Brandt recorded and transcribed Sheeran's account of his life in extraordinary detail. The methodology was that of a former prosecutor, systematic, careful, designed to identify inconsistencies and push past them toward the truth that lay underneath. Brandt later said that Sheeran was tormented by what he had done to Hoffa, that the Catholic conscience that had been instilled in him by his parents at Our Mother of Sorrows Church in West Philadelphia, the Irish Catholic faith that had been the bedrock of his family's identity, had never been fully silenced even by decades of professional killing. The Hoffa murder sat differently from the others. The others were men he had not known, or men he had known professionally, or men whose deaths were acquired by the logic of the world he operated in, and which carried no personal attachment. Hoffa was his friend, and the betrayal of that friendship was the stone that had been sitting at the bottom of whatever he had, where other people have a soul. The confessions covered 5 main areas. First, the Hoffa killing. As described in detail above, the road trip with Bufalino, the motel conversation, the flight to Detroit, the parking lot, the house on Beaverland Street. Second, the Gallo killing at Umberto's Clam House, Sheeran's account of being sent by Bufalino, walking into the restaurant, shooting Gallo's driver, following Gallo out the door, shooting him in the street. This account, as discussed, is contradicted by multiple other sources and is among the most disputed of Sheeran's claims. Third, the Bay of Pigs weapons run, driving a truck from Baltimore to Florida in 1961 with weapons for the CIA's anti-Castro operation, meeting David Ferry, delivering to E. Howard Hunt. Fourth, the broader context of the JFK assassination, Sheeran's account of Hoffa's belief that Kennedy's murder was sanctioned by organized crime to remove Bobby Kennedy, and Sheeran's claim to have transported weapons that may have been connected to the conspiracy. He was careful in this area to frame things as knowledge rather than direct participation. Fifth, an accounting of approximately 25 to 30 murders committed during his career, some with names, some without, all delivered with the matter-of-fact quality of a man recounting professional activity, rather than confessing to individual moral crimes. He genuinely could not remember the exact number. Brandt published, "I heard you paint houses." Frank, the Irishman. Sheeran and the closing of the case on Jimmy Hoffa in 2004, 6 months after. Sheeran died on December 14, 2003. At the age of 83, in the nursing home in Westchester. Sheeran never saw the book published. But 6 weeks before his death, according to Brandt, Sheeran read the final manuscript and gave his approval. Brandt also recorded a video of Sheeran near the very end of his life, stating that he stood behind everything written in the book. Sheeran's daughter Dolores, who had been given power of attorney and who cleared out her father's apartment after his death, discovering 200 designer suits and 100 pairs of shoes, the remnants of the gentleman's quarterly wardrobe of a man who had always, even at his lowest, dressed like someone who commanded respect, came to believe that her father had told the truth. "I know now that he killed his friend Jimmy," she said. "He had no choice. He was acting on orders. If he hadn't done it, he would have been killed." She was not trying to excuse him. She was trying to explain the specific logic of the world he had inhabited, a world in which loyalty was absolute, and the cost of disloyalty was your own life. In that world, he had no choice is not a moral defense. It is simply a description of the architecture of the constraints that existed. Frank Sheeran's deathbed confessions were not accepted without challenge. They were challenged immediately and persistently by credible people with direct knowledge of the events in question, and the challenges were substantive enough that to present the Sheeran account without them would be to tell less than the whole story. The most significant challenger was Harvard Law School professor Jack Goldsmith, a man whose credentials in the area of federal law and criminal investigation are impeccable, and who had a uniquely personal connection to the case. Goldsmith is the stepson of Chucky O'Brien, Jimmy Hoffa's foster son, the man who, in Sheeran's account, drove the car that brought Hoffa to the house on Beaverlawn Street. Goldsmith spent years examining the evidence surrounding Hoffa's disappearance with the rigorous methodology of a legal scholar, who also happened to have access to O'Brien's personal knowledge and memories. His conclusion was direct and unambiguous. Frank Sheeran was not involved in the killing of Jimmy Hoffa, was not nearly as close to Hoffa as Brandt's account portrays, and the confession was a fabrication, whether a deliberate lie, a confabulation of things Sheeran had heard, or something in between. The specific evidentiary problems with Sheeran's account are substantial. Sheeran's account of his timeline on July 30th, 1975, places him picking up Hoffa from the parking lot at approximately 2:45 p.m. But Hoffa's phone call to his wife Josephine was recorded at approximately 3:30 p.m. From the payphone in the parking lot, Hoffa was calling to say he was still waiting, still alone, still in the parking lot. That call was made at a time when Sheeran claims Hoffa was already in the car being driven to the house on Beaverland Street. The timeline does not reconcile. FBI surveillance recordings from a bar called the Vesuvio Restaurant captured Frank Sheeran sometime after Hoffa's disappearance, telling close associates that he was not in Detroit the day Hoffa disappeared. He told them he had gas receipts. He told them he had dinner witnesses, approximately 18 people who could confirm his whereabouts. He reportedly wrote a letter to the FBI providing this alibi information. Former FBI agent Jim Dooley, who worked the Hoffa case from New Jersey in the 1970s, reviewed Sheeran's full statement from that recorded conversation and said it made clear that Sheeran was explicitly distancing himself from any involvement. The blood found in the house on Beaverland Street was tested twice, once in 2004 and again in 2006, using increasingly sophisticated forensic technology. On neither occasion did the blood match Jimmy Hoffa's DNA. The FBI was able to obtain the DNA comparison from biological material provided by Hoffa's surviving family members. The blood in the house did not belong to Jimmy Hoffa, Nicholas Gage, a former New York Times reporter who covered the Mafia for years and wrote extensively about organized crime. described Brandt's book as the most fabricated mafia tale since the fake autobiography of Lucky Luciano 40 years ago. Gage was not a sensationalist. He was one of the most respected mob journalists of his generation, and his dismissal of the book carried weight. Even Martin Scorsese, whose 2019 film brought the Sheeran story to the widest possible audience. 10 Academy Award nominations, starring Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci, made on a budget of approximately $160 million, and widely considered one of the greatest mob films ever made, was careful in his statements about the truth of the underlying account. "This is not Frank Sheeran in the film," Scorsese said. "It's some character we all created." Robert De Niro echoed him. "We're not saying we're telling the actual story. We're telling our story," Charles Brandt, who wrote the book and whose lifetime of work as a prosecutor and author is bound up in the credibility of the confession, insists that Sheeran told the truth. He points to the internal consistency of Sheeran's account, to the FBI's own early designation of Sheeran as a suspect, to the book's corroborating details and the woman who identified Sheeran at Umberto's. The two positions, Brandt's absolute conviction and Goldsmith's absolute skepticism, cannot both be right. And 50 years on from the parking lot of the Machu's Red Fox, the evidence available does not definitively settle the question. What we are left with is this: a man who claimed on his deathbed to have committed one of the most famous crimes in American history. A man who had, demonstrably, spent decades killing people for money and loyalty. A man with a Catholic conscience that, by all accounts, had been working on him for years. And a man who may have been telling the exact truth, or may have been placing himself at the center of a story that was simply the grandest stage available to him at the end of a life that had always been about operating in the largest possible theater. Every story that involves power and violence eventually arrives at the question of what is left when both are gone. Not legacy in the sense of monuments and institutions and things that carry a name forward, but legacy in the more honest sense of what a life leaves in the world and in the people who knew it and were shaped by it. Let us account for the people in this story. Jimmy Hoffa vanished on July 30th, 1975, and was officially declared legally dead on July 30th, 1982. His case remains open. The FBI has never stopped investigating his disappearance. It has excavated sites in Michigan, New Jersey, and elsewhere, acting on tips that have continued to arrive for 50 years. A field in northern Oakland County, Michigan, suggested by reputed gangster Tony Zerilli in 2013 as a possible burial site, was investigated by the FBI that same year. 3 days of excavation, no human remains. In 2004 and 2006, the house on Beaverland Street was forensically examined. No match to Hoffa's DNA. The search continues, and will likely continue until the last person with any possible knowledge is dead, which means it will never be conclusively closed. His son, James P. Hoffa, took over the Teamsters presidency in 1999 and led the union until 2021. The son spent decades in the shadow of the father's legend, trying to rehabilitate the union's reputation, fighting the federal oversight that had been imposed in 1989 as a result of the corruption that Hoffa's era had embedded in the organization's structure, and navigating the complex emotional inheritance of being the son of a man who was simultaneously a labor hero to millions of truck drivers and a symbol of everything corrupt about mid-century American power. Russell Bufalino was convicted in 1978 of extortion and conspiracy to murder, in a case that also touched on the larger conspiracy surrounding Hoffa's disappearance. He served several years in federal prison, was released due to age and health, and died on February 25, 1994, at the age of approximately 90 in Good Samaritan Hospital in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He was, to the end, a man of absolute silence. He never commented on the Hoffa case, on the Sheeran confessions, on any of it. His crime family, formerly known as the Northeastern Pennsylvania Crime Family, informally as the Bufalino Crime Family, continued to exist, in diminished form, and appears in FBI files to this day. Anthony Tony Provenzano was convicted in 1978 of the 1961 murder of Anthony Castelletto, a Teamsters official who had opposed Provenzano's leadership. He died in federal prison in 1988 at the age of 71, without ever being charged in connection with Hoffa's disappearance, though he remains one of the most widely suspected participants in the conspiracy that killed Hoffa. His name appears in virtually every serious account of the case. Anthony Giacolone, the Detroit Mafia figure who was one of the two men Hoffa believed he was meeting at the Machu's Red Fox, was never charged in connection with Hoffa's disappearance. He continued to operate in Detroit organized crime and died in 2001. His son's car was the vehicle used to collect Hoffa from the parking lot. According to Sheeran's account, a detail that implicates the family deeply in the logistics of the killing. Whatever Giacolone's direct role may have been, Frank Fitzsimmons served as Teamsters president until his death from lung cancer on May 6, 1981. He was president of the union for approximately 14 years in total, first as acting president during Hoffa's imprisonment, then as full president after Hoffa's enforced removal from union activities. His administration was as corrupt as Hoffa's, without the complicated mitigating factor of Hoffa's genuine commitment to the material welfare of the workers he represented. Fitzsimmons was simply a man who enjoyed the access to power and money that came with the position, and used them accordingly. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters was placed under court-supervised federal oversight in 1989 as part of a consent decree resulting from the RICO prosecution of the union's leadership. The decree required the union to hold genuinely democratic elections for the first time in its history, supervised by a federal officer, and to submit to ongoing monitoring of its finances and internal operations. The union has been operating under various degrees of this oversight for most of the period since, though it has fought persistently to have it lifted and has made genuine progress in reforming its internal structure. It remains one of the largest labor unions in the United States, with approximately 1.5 million members as of the time of this telling, and it continues to do important work advocating for the wages and benefits of truck drivers and other workers. But the era of its greatest power, the era when Hoffa could look at a senator across a hearing room table and make the senator blink, first is as gone as Hoffa himself. Chucky O'Brien, Hoffa's foster son, the man who drove the car on July 30th, 1975, in Sheeran's account, denied any knowledge of or involvement in Hoffa's disappearance for the rest of his life. He died in 2020. His stepson, the Harvard law professor Jack Goldsmith, who challenged the Sheeran account so forcefully, became one of the most prominent legal scholars in the United States and served at the highest levels of the Justice Department during the George W. Bush administration. It is one of the more remarkable coincidences of this story that the man who most authoritatively challenged the credibility of Frank Sheeran's confession had a direct family connection to one of the central figures in the events being confessed to, Charles Brandt, who wrote, "I heard you paint houses," and staked his considerable professional reputation on the accuracy of Sheeran's account, continues to maintain that the confession was genuine. He has pointed to the internal consistency of Sheeran's account across 5 years of recorded conversations, the consistency that he, as a former prosecutor who had spent his career identifying lies and finding truth, found convincing. He has noted that dying men do not generally benefit from false confessions of murder, particularly in the absence of a legal immunity agreement. He has stood by the book through every challenge that has been made to it. Martin Scorsese's The Irishman was released in November 2019. first in limited theatrical release and then globally on Netflix. It is 3 hours and 29 minutes long, the longest film of Scorsese's career, and it is, by the consensus of almost everyone who has seriously engaged with it, a masterpiece of American cinema. Robert De Niro's performance as Frank Sheeran is among the finest of his career. Al Pacino's Hoffa is a monument, full of electricity and heat and the specific quality of a man who burns at a temperature that ordinary people simply cannot sustain. Joe Pesci, who came out of retirement to play Russell Bufalino, delivers a performance of quiet, devastating authority that is unlike anything else in his remarkable career. The film received 10 Academy Award nominations and won none. The nominated categories were dominated by other films that year, but its standing in the history of American crime cinema is secure and growing. Frank Sheeran was buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Yeton, Pennsylvania, on December 17, 2003. His grave is plain. There is no monument to the magnitude of what he claimed to have done. No marker that identifies him as anything more than a man who was born and died and left, according to the official accounting, a modest material legacy of 200 suits, 100 pairs of shoes, and a confession that may be the most important unsolved criminal admission in American history, or may be nothing more than an old man's final, elaborate story. His daughter Dolores, who cleared out his apartment and discovered the suits and the shoes and the jewelry that represented the one area in which Frank Sheeran had never tried to be invisible, said that despite the horror of what she learned from reading the book, she was grateful for one thing, that her father did not die the way most of his associates had died. He chose his own time to go after confessing his sins to the person he trusted to hear them. After reading the manuscript that would carry his account into the world, after living to 83 years old, an extraordinary age for a man in his profession, in an era when the men around him were dying of federal prosecutions and mob hits, and the ordinary violence of the world they had chosen. Most of his associates died horrible early deaths, Dolores said. I am eternally grateful he didn't die like that. There is a question that this story raises, and which no amount of historical investigation fully answers. It is not the question of whether Frank Sheeran killed Jimmy Hoffa. That question may never have a definitive answer. It is a different question, a more uncomfortable one. What does it mean to be good at killing? Frank Sheeran was good at it, not in the way that soldiers are made good at it through training and conditioning, and the specific dehumanization of an enemy, though he had been made good at it that way first. In the 45th Infantry Division, in Sicily and at Anzio and along the Rhine, he was good at it in a way that went beyond training, that had something to do with the specific wiring of a specific person who had been shaped by a Depression-era childhood of physical hardship and emotional deprivation, and then by 411 days of combat, and then by a world that offered him the specific reward he was best positioned to earn. He loved his children. His daughter Dolores describes a father who was complicated, often absent in ways that were not only physical, capable of great warmth, and capable of leaving that warmth behind when something in the world he inhabited demanded it. He dressed beautifully. He loved to dance. He was loyal, with a loyalty that was real and not performative, to the people he had decided deserved it. He told, at the end, the truth, or something he believed to be the truth, to the one person he trusted to hear it without judgment. These things are all true at the same time that all the killing is true. That is what makes this story impossible to fully resolve into a verdict. It is not the story of a monster, in the simple sense of a person who is only capable of one thing. It is the story of a person who was fully capable of multiple things, and who navigated a world that rewarded the worst of them. The America that produced Frank Sheeran was an America in which the lines between legitimate labor, political power, and organized crime were so thoroughly blurred that navigating from one to the other required less a moral leap than a simple step to the side. The Teamsters built the material life of millions of American workers, drivers, who could buy houses and send their children to college because Jimmy Hoffa had negotiated wages that the market would never have produced voluntarily. Those same Teamsters were also a mob bank and a murder-enabling operation and a vehicle for the systematic corruption of American labor. Both of these things are completely true, and Frank Sheeran existed inside that double truth, doing real harm in the service of real good, and real good in the service of real harm, and eventually doing something that was only harm. In a house in Detroit that erased everything else. The paint dried a long time ago, but some stains never really disappear. Frank Sheeran is buried in Yedden, Pennsylvania. The neighborhood is quiet. The grave is ordinary. Jimmy Hoffa is buried, probably, somewhere in this country, in the ground or ash. The remains of the most powerful labor leader in American history exist in whatever condition decades have left them. No one knows where. The FBI keeps a file open. Tips come in. Fields are excavated. Nothing is found in New York. On Mulberry Street, in what is left of Little Italy, a restaurant operates on the site. Relocated, rebuilt. Not quite the same location, but close enough, where Crazy Joe Gallo bled out on a sidewalk on his 43rd birthday. Tourists come to see it. The case is officially unsolved. In Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, the federal penitentiary where Jimmy Hoffa served 4.5 years of a 13-year sentence still operates. Other men serve their time there. Other stories accumulate. Other lives are suspended between the entering and the leaving. In Philadelphia, in Derby, the neighborhood where Frank Sheeran grew up during the Depression is changed and unchanged at the same time. The houses are the same. The streets are the same. The Catholic churches are still there. The air still carries the faint industrial quality of a place that exists in the margins of bigger stories. In Westchester, Pennsylvania, the nursing home where Frank Sheeran spent his last years is still operational. Other old men sit in its rooms and look out its windows at the ordinary landscape of suburban Pennsylvania and carry their own weights, of whatever kind, in whatever silence they have available to them. And Martin Scorsese's film plays on Netflix, 3 hours and 29 minutes of Robert De Niro's face carrying the weight of a story that may be true and may be partly invention, and may be both simultaneously, and people watch it at 2 in the morning and at noon on Sundays and wonder whether they believe the old man in the wheelchair at the end. The man who asked the priest to leave the door open just a crack, because he wanted to see down the hallway, just in case. In case what? In case someone was coming? In case there was still someone out there who needed to be seen, who needed acknowledgement, who needed the door to be open rather than shut. In case the man he killed was somewhere in that hallway, in the dark, just beyond the light, waiting for something that Frank Sheeran could not name and could not provide and could not stop wanting to give. The door stayed open. The hallway was empty. Or maybe it wasn't. That question has been open for 50 years. It will likely be open for 50 more. And in the world Frank Sheeran came from, the world of men who painted houses and did their own carpentry, who served 600% of the average soldier's combat time, who drove trucks across the American Northeast in the 1950s carrying weapons and meat and whatever else needed moving, who stood in parking lots in suburban Michigan in the summer of 1975 and made decisions that erased people from the world. In that world, the only certainty was that someone had to do the job. Someone always had to do the job. Frank Sheeran did his. Whether that makes him guilty or simply inevitable, whether the story he told at the end was truth or theater, whether the paint he left on a wall in Detroit is still there in whatever form blood becomes after half a century. These questions don't have answers. They have only the echo of a phone call from a payphone in a parking lot. A woman in a lake house picking up the line. Her husband's voice tired and frustrated, saying he's coming home, saying he's done waiting, and then silence. And that is the true story of Frank the Irishman Sheeran, a boy born in poverty in Darby, Pennsylvania, on October 25, 1920. A soldier who served more than 4 times the average combat duty in the worst campaigns of the Second World War, and came home changed in ways that took decades to fully reveal themselves. A truck driver who became a hitman, who became a union boss, who became one of the most powerful criminal figures in mid-century America, and who, if his account is to be believed, killed the best friend he ever had because the world he had chosen left him no other option. A man who died at 83 years old in a nursing home, dressed impeccably with 200 suits in his closet, having confessed his sins into a tape recorder operated by the only lawyer he had ever fully trusted. Whether he was telling the complete truth, a partial truth, or an old man's last claim to a legend larger than himself, we will never know with certainty. The truth in this story, as in so many stories about the American underworld of the 20th century, has been buried along with the evidence, the witnesses, and the men themselves. What we know for certain is that Jimmy Hoffa disappeared on a Wednesday afternoon in July 1975 and was never found. What we know for certain is that Frank Sheeran killed people, many people, over many years, for money and loyalty. What we know for certain is that the most powerful labor union in American history was also one of the most thoroughly corrupted institutions in the country, and that its corruption touched things that went all the way from the building of Las Vegas to the corridors of the White House. What we know for certain is that a man who could have chosen otherwise, who had come home from the war, a decorated soldier, who had a wife and daughters and a good union, job in the framework of a decent life, chose instead to step through a door that, once entered, could not be exited. And what we know for certain is that he died with the door to his room left open just a crack. Because even at the end, Frank Sheeran wanted to see down the hallway. Just to see. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Frank Sheeran was telling the truth about Jimmy Hoffa? Or do you think he was a dying man, a Catholic man, building one last myth for himself before the lights went out? Drop your answer in the comments right now. This is one of those stories where the conversation never ends, and I want to know where you stand. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, thank you, genuinely. You just spent hours in some of the darkest corners of American history. In parking lots in Michigan, and artillery barrages in Sicily, and nursing homes in Pennsylvania. And that is not nothing. That is the kind of attention that real stories deserve and very rarely get. If this moved you, if it made you think, if it gave you something to carry with you, please hit the like button. It takes you 2 seconds, and it tells the algorithm that this story deserves to be heard by more people. Subscribe if you haven't already. Every week I bring you stories from the real places, not the Hollywood versions, not the cleaned up versions, but the full, complicated, human versions. Turn on the notification bell so the next story finds you. And wherever you are right now, whatever city, whatever country, whatever time it is, I hope you sleep well tonight, because some of us, having heard this story, might find it a little harder. And if you can't sleep, well, come back. There are more stories where this one came from.